Dr. Grant Ralston here, delivering a Unit 1 lecture on the physiology of stress, and this goes together within the mental health unit that is free at strengthphysiology.online. And we've got various components in which we wish to go through today. So the objectives of this session is to get you to develop a greater understanding regarding the various types of stress, the stress response, mechanisms of stress, the impact stress has on the body, and suppression of the immune system. So this should take approximately about 45 minutes or so on which to go through the following slides. So, things to think about. Stress is part of our everyday lives, but people tend to experience a higher level of stress during major life changes, especially with what we're going through at the moment when we're seeing all the various changes that's occurring because of COVID-19. Other examples are people entering college, and that can be for some of them a stressful time period with a major life transition into adulthood. And this occurs as these younger adults begin to increase their independence by moving out of the parents' home and becoming more responsible for their own schedule. So when we cast our mind back, the college years are also a time when individuals are exposed to chronic stress related to these new life circumstances. When stress is related to the transition to college life is inadequately managed, individuals may experience adjustment difficulties, and as a result, their life satisfaction can be diminished. But it's important to note that not everyone who is exposed to this life transition experiences adjustment difficulties or experiences life dissatisfaction. Many individuals learn to adapt to life transitions successfully while maintaining high levels of life satisfaction despite the increased stress level. And it really is important that we just cast our minds back and just reflect a little bit about what we've been going through for the last 9 months and how we are starting to reflect upon these major life transitions as imposed upon us and how everybody is reacting and adjusting differently, and how all this has a knock-on effect with individuals' perception to the outside world and how they're actually coping with regards to their own mental health. It's how we perceive the environment is the most important thing to take away from there. So let's look at back a little bit and let's start looking at some of the models of stress, and let's look at some of the scientists that sort of helped us develop a greater understanding without it. So for centuries, physicians and patients have made the association between adverse life events and illness. The links between emotion and sudden cardiac death have been repeatedly noted in sources as diverse as the Bible, anthropology, and also clinical experience. For example, William Harvey in the 17th century and William Osler in the 19th century frequently alluded to the relationship between adverse life events and illness. There's been many contemporary cultures. It's regarded stress as the outcome of being out of balance with the environment. At the top left, or at the left-hand side of the PowerPoint, Walter Cannon, and this Cannon methodologically investigated the other great pathway of stress responses, the sympathetic nervous system. Cannon also found on more immediate or short-term responses to stressors. When we look at Hans Seeley, the term stress was originally coined by him. And he observed that many highly diverse ways of perturbing the organism resulted in common physiological responses. Seeley invoked the adrenal cortical system as the crucial responder to stressful stimulation. He also observed that any novelty or perturbation of the system was associated with an elevation of adrenal cortical activity. So what about this more in the applied setting? So when we look at this graph, if we want, we're looking at this optimal level in which we function in this environment on a day-to-day basis. Stress is a word which everyone really knows and everybody says. And we often use the term in our daily lives frequently. It's important to note stress is not a situation or a condition during an adverse condition, as it is generally assumed. In fact, it is a way by which the body overcomes a demanding or undesirable situation. Whenever we are in some unfavourable condition, whether it's physical or whether it's psychological, our body tries to maintain the homeostasis and protect itself from such events that adopting some changes. Stress is a series of events our body follows to cope with such situations. As we saw in the last slide, Seeley used the term stress to represent the effects of anything that seriously threatens homeostasis of the body. Both external and internal factors affect homeostasis of the body. Though stress is commonly associated with disagreeable states and experiences, but it is not always the case. Stress is simply a response to physical or emotional demands. Whenever we feel stressed, this usually means that the demands of the situation exceed all our available resources. And generally, when we talk about stress in our lives, we are talking about stressors. So, any factor or event that causes stress is called or termed a stressor. Stressors can be many types, whether it's physiological changes in the body, changes of the environment, life events or behaviours. Even our imaginary based situations can act as a stressor and could be the reason of stress. In fact, in most of the cases, it is just an imagination which is the cause of the stress. Hence, it is very important how we perceive an event or a given situation. When we're looking at coping is expending conscious effort to solve personal and interpersonal problems and seeking to master, minimise or tolerate stress or conflict. The effectiveness of coping efforts depend on the type of stress and or the conflict, and the particular individual and the circumstances they're surrounded in. So based on a theory of stress and coping developed by Laris and Folkman in 1984, stress is not simply events that trigger negative emotional responses, but it is a two-way process where individuals interact with their environment. Simply put it, stress can impact individuals' well-being or functionally negatively only when individuals perceive the situation as stressful and their resources are inadequate to handle environmental stimuli. And that could be in a breakup, loss of a loved one, the financial constraints such as redundancy, or what we're experiencing at the moment with COVID-19. Lazarus and Folkman further proposed the concepts of cognitive appraisal, and that is primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. In order to explain individual differences in coping with stressful life events and its relation to well-being and functioning of individuals. So primary appraisal is a process in which individuals evaluate situations as threatening, neutral positive, or not relevant, whereas secondary appraisal is explained as the process in which individuals assess their coping resources in response to the primary appraisal evaluation. So it really is dependent on how individuals perceive the threat level of the environmental stimuli. These individuals will determine whether their coping resources are adequate or not. And this secondary appraisal will consequently affect individuals' well-being. So there's various types of stress. Acute stress is the stress that occurs for a short period of time. It comes on quickly and also goes away quickly. It is usually short-lived. And acute stress is generally recognised with symptoms such as anger, anxiety, irritability, and acute periods of depression. Sometimes it may bring thrills, pleasure, and excitement in our lives. When acute stress is felt too frequently, it is called episodic stress. So episodic acute stress in some people occurs due to a series of stressful challenges that's occurring one after another in their lives. When a stress persists for longer duration, it is called a chronic stress. And chronic stress is brought about by the long-term exposure to stressors. Chronic stressors may be as intense as acute stressors, but they are more harmful than acute stressors. And this is because the effect of chronic stress is the accumulated effects of stressors for a long period of time. Chronic stress not only affects the physical health, but is equally harmful for mental health, and the effects occur due to the accumulated stress. So we're looking at Hans Selye's general adaptation model or syndrome. So whenever the body is exposed to a stressor, which may be imaginative or real, a response is elicited to overcome it, this perception of it. The response is not uniform in all individuals, and also besides the intensity and duration of the stressor, there's other factors such as the individual's age, gender, personality, and the physical and psychological health, and also their past experiences have an influence in the stress response. So Hans Selye developed this general adaptation syndrome, or the GAS model, and it's a profile of how organisms respond to stress. And within this model, there's 3 stages in the stress response in which we'll go through. There's the alarm phase, the adaptation phase, exhaustion, or recovery. So in the alarm phase is the first stage that involves this physiological fight or flight response. This is the stage which enables us to deal with the difficult adverse situations. And the body is prepared either to face the perceived threat or to escape from it. This stage invokes various reactions in the body, including release of stress hormones such as cortisol, adrenaline, or noradrenaline from the adrenal glands. And as a result, it increases heart rate, it elevates blood sugar levels, and increases blood pressure. If the stressful situation isn't resolved, the body uses all its resources to adapt to the stressful situation. And this is the adaptation stage. This results in various types of physical, mental, and emotional behavioural problems. Physical problems could be sleep, general tiredness, muscular pains, indigestion, minor infections such as common colds or cold sores. When we're looking at the psychological impairments or problems, lack of concentration, we're looking at emotional component of it, being impatient or grumpy. And when we're looking at this behavioural problems, it could be looking at substance misuse as well as alcohol consumption or excessive alcohol consumption. If the body's compensation mechanisms have succeeded in overcoming the stressor's effect, there follows the recovery phase. But if the body has used up its resources and is unable to maintain normal function, it leads to an exhaustion phase. And if the exhaustion stage persists for a long period of time, it can cause long-term effects where the individual is at risk of suffering from more serious health conditions. And that can lead to depression, hypertension, as well as coronary vascular disease. So the mechanisms of stress. Following a stressful event, the body acts at different levels to cope with the stressor. And this is achieved through two major changes in the body. The change in the pattern or the amount of the release of energy, and secondly, the change in the distribution of energy. And there's several events that occur to bring about these changes. And all these events are collectively called stress or the stress response. And stress is a multidimensional phenomenon which involves both the nervous and endocrine system. So the first step in stress response is the perception of the threat, and as we understand, we call that the stressor. Whenever there is some stressor, whether we imagine it or it's real, it acts at the level in the brain. And in the brain, it is the hypothalamus which perceives the stressor. When the hypothalamus encounters a threat, it performs some specific functioning, including the activation of the autonomic nervous system. It also stimulates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis by releasing corticotrophin releasing hormone, and it also secretes an antidiuretic hormone. In addition to this, the autonomic nervous system, which consists of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the ANS, being the autonomic nervous system, regulates visual activities including the circulation, digestion, breathing rates, temperature regulation, and also some vital organs. So when we look at the sympathetic system, that accounts for the fight or flight response. In response to a stressor, catecholamines, being adrenaline and noradrenaline, are released at various neurosynapses. And the release of these catecholamines causes several damages or changes, like increases in the heart rate and force of the myocardial contractions, as well as vasodilation of the arteries through the working muscles and vasoconstriction of arteries to non-essential muscles. Other responses are the dilation of pupils and the bronchi and reduction of the digestive activities in the body. And all these changes are required to prepare the body for this flight or flight response. And the effects of these hormones, such as adrenaline and noradrenaline, last only for a few seconds. The functions of the parasympathetic nervous system are opposite to that of the sympathetic nervous system in helping energy conservation and relaxation. So cortical releasing hormones, or C, as you can see in the figure here, CRH, acts at the anterior pituitary gland. It's an endocrine gland located in the brain. And the pituitary gland is also called the master gland, as it controls the secretion of other endocrine glands in the body. When it's on stimulation by the corticotrophin releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary gland secretes adrenocorticotrophin hormones, or ACTH. So ACTH, released from the anterior pituitary gland in response to the corticotrophin releasing hormone, stimulates adrenal glands located on the kidneys. And there are two parts of the adrenal glands. The outer part, called the cortex, and the inner part known as the medulla. So ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release corticoids. So we've got glucocorticoids and mineral corticoids. And the major function of these is to release energy, which is required to cope with the ill effects of stress. So the energy is released by conversion of glycogen into glucose, being in a series of reactions called gluconeolysis, and also by breaking down of fats and the fatty acids and glycerols, and that's deemed lipolysis. In addition to this, corticoids have several other functions, such as an increased concentration and production of urine. It actually suppresses our appetite, it suppresses the immune system, It exacerbates gastric irritation, gives us a sore stomach, and also associated feeling of depression and loss of control. And these are the symptoms generally seen in an individual undergoing stress or under stress. So mineralocorticoid promotes sodium retention and elimination of potassium. It increases blood pressure by increasing blood volume. And the medulla part of the adrenal gland secretes adrenaline and noradrenaline. And the function of these hormones are the same as that of those secreted from nerve endings of the sympathetic nervous system. These hormones secreted by the adrenal medulla reinforce the functions of the sympathetic nervous system, and the release of these hormones from the adrenal medulla acts as a backup system to ensure the most efficient means of physical survival. The effects brought out by adrenaline and noradrenaline from the sympathetic nervous system may be termed as an immediate effects, and the effects brought out by those of the adrenal medulla are intermediate effects. So, in addition to the HPA axis, some other hormones, such as growth hormones and thyroid hormones, also play significant roles in stress. Growth hormone is a peptide hormone, and it's released from the anterior pituitary gland. And growth hormone is a stress hormone that raises the concentration of glucose and free fatty acids. It's been observed that in humans, being psychologically stimulated, it increases the concentration of the thyroid hormones. And thyroid releases thyroxine, and these hormones have also a significant function in stress. The main function of thyroid hormones is to increase overall metabolic rate or basal metabolic rate. And thyroxine also increases heart rate and also the sensitivity of some tissues to the catecholamines. Though serotonin and melatonin are not considered a stress hormone, yet they are associated with mood, and a decrease in the levels of these hormones is thought to be related to depression. So when the body is unable to cope with the stress, or if the stress persists for a chronic period of time, it affects the body in numerous ways. And the effects of stress are not limited to one or two organs or systems. Stress affects the whole of the body in various ways. Stress affects both physically as well as psychologically. And the impact of stress on the body may not be the same in all individuals. It may vary depending on factors like the individual's genotype, sex, age, physiological conditions, and past experiences of the person. But some of these effects are common to every individual, and most of the effects are due to increased concentrations of corticoids and adrenaline. And some major events on the body systems are the effect of the digestive system affecting the circulation and the suppression of the immune system. So the effects on the digestive system, it leads to disturbed eating habits, acid reflux, diarrhea, or constipation, and these are the common symptoms seen in stressed individuals. Stress can also be related to obesity, which is linked to a host of other health problems. There's no clear evidence that stressful life events promote the development of diabetes in children or in adults, but hormonal changes occur during acute and chronic stress, and this can affect glucose homeostasis in both healthy people and in those with diabetes. There have been several studies that have reported a negative effect of acute stress on the maintenance of blood glucose concentrations in individuals with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So extreme stress can be associated with diabetes, and this is because excessive cortisol can affect the activity of insulin, and the body can also become resistant to insulin, and this can lead to diabetes. When we look at the effects on circulation, there are several studies that have demonstrated a strong association between stress and cardiovascular disease. According to Elst and colleagues, stress plays a significant role in susceptibility and the outcome of cardiovascular diseases. Psychological stresses are associated with cardiovascular diseases to the extent that the cardiovascular disease are among the most important group of psychosomatic diseases. Cardiovascular diseases due to stress-induced mechanisms are mediated primarily through the increased androgenic stimulation, and that's both adrenaline and cortisol affect heart and blood pressure. Too much adrenaline makes blood pressure elevate, which in turn affects the functioning of the heart, since the heart has to pump harder and faster. And this can produce coronary heart disease, strokes, and sudden cardiac arrest. Stress has been reported to be a predictor of incidence of coronary heart disease and hypertension among both males and females. And according to Trophy and colleagues, stress can cause increased oxygen demand on the body, spasms of the coronary blood vessels, and electrical instability in the heart's conduction system. Chronic stress also leads to increased blood cholesterol levels, and the persistent high levels of cholesterol and other fatty substances in the blood may cause atherosclerosis and sometimes may be a reason for heart attacks. Cortisol also plays an important role in the accumulation of abdominal fat, leading to obesity. And occupational stress also has a significant influence on the onset of cardiovascular heart disease. So the persistent activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in chronic stress response actually impairs or can impair the immune response, and it leads to various types of infections. There has been some evidence that demonstrates that people under chronic stress are more susceptible to viral illnesses like the common cold or flus than other people. The high levels of stress hormones suppress the release of cytokine chemicals secreted by the T helper cells. Cytokines regulate both cell-mediated and humoral immune responses in the body. Two types of cytokines are released from the T helper cells. T helper 1 cytokines stimulate cytotoxic T cells and natural killer cells. And these cells that are involved in the direct killing of target intracellular pathogens, while the T helper 2 cytokines stimulate B cells to produce antibodies, and these antibodies are the humoral immune response. Chronic stress may also dysregulate the T helper 1 and T helper 2 cytokines that can lead to suppression of both cell-mediated and humoral immune responses. Additionally, T helper 1 and 2 chronic stress to produce stress also affects pro-inflammatory cytokines, and these cytokines are involved in the inflammatory process. According to the work of Miller, stress may continue to promote pro-inflammatory cytokine production indefinitely. Pro-inflammatory cytokines feedback to the central nervous system and produce symptoms of fatigue, diminished appetite, and other symptoms usually associated with depression. And there's been studies conducted regarding the association of stress with AIDS. Lesserman and colleagues found that faster progression to AIDS was associated with higher cumulative stress life events, use of denial as a coping mechanism, lower satisfaction with social support, and elevated serum cortisol. So according to some, stress or a stressful life event are considered important in terms of impacting the key biological markers of the disease's viral load and cell count. And lastly, other effects of stress hormones. In addition to the above mentioned effects, cortisol also alters bone mineral density and thus affecting the development of new bones in the body. In young children, stress may impinge their growth, and in some cases, stress could also be a cause of cancer. The persistent activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the chronic stress response and depression probably impairs the immune response and contributes to the development and progression of some types of cancers. There's been evidence that's indicated that stress can promote breast cancer cell colonization of bone. Stress also interferes with the reproductive system, both in males and females. And since sex life depends on fitness of body and mind, chronic stress may decrease the libido and may even cause erectile dysfunction or impotence in males. In the case of chronic stress, testosterone levels can drop to an extent that can interfere in sperm production, and in women, stress can affect the menstrual cycle, and that can lead to irregular, heavy or painful periods. In addition to its direct effect on health, stress also produces some behavioural changes, and people living in stressful environments are more prone to smoking, which could lead to respiratory disorders and may even lead to cancer. And similarly, stressed people are more vulnerable to alcohol consumption, which has its own consequences. So there we have it. There's a little bit of a breakdown on the effects or the physiology of stress and the impact stress has upon the body. So I hope you found that useful.